Good afternoon, everyone. Good Wednesday afternoon. Welcome to another book forum with the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm Kent Lassman, and today we'll be visiting with Tevi Troy about his recently released Fight House, Rivalries in the White House from Truman to Trump. Tevi is a presidential historian and former White House advisor, as well as a senior official at the Departments of Labor, as well as the Health and Human Services Department. His previous books have covered the relationship between presidents and culture, as well as the role of executive leadership during disaster management. I found his latest book a delight. It's right here. I want to make sure you see the cover so you can find it on bookshelves or at Amazon. It's a breezy read, but it also taught me some things of real use. The book has equal portions of historical anecdote and gossipy stories that come out after administrations that really illuminate the high ego environment of Washington, D.C., but it also provides an intellectual framework to help you understand what systems work in the pressure cooker environment of the White House. Today we're recording the event. It'll be available on YouTube. I hope if you enjoy what you see and hear that you'll share that link. And if you're watching live, I'd like you to be part of the conversation. Throughout the next hour, I'll monitor questions from our audience that come in online. You can either email them to events@cei.org, or if you look down near the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button that allows you to send them in directly. That's my preamble today. Tevi, I want to welcome you to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I really appreciate the time that you make to be with us today.
Thanks, Ken. We've been talking about doing this for a while, and I'm glad we were able to make it work out, so I appreciate it.
Let's get started with the biggest softball that you're going to have for the day. I don't think we have too many people in the audience that are of the too long, didn't read it approach, but what are the most important ideas that you want people to take away from Fight House?
Right. Thanks for that good question. And it is right in my wheelhouse, as you suggest. Look, Fight House is about infighting in the White House. And the idea here is that infighting happens in every White House. It's part of the landscape. It's something the president and chief of staff have to manage. Some White Houses will have some more, some will have less, but every one of them has it. And so I was interested in this topic originally in the early days of the Trump administration when people were saying there's so much fighting in the White House, we've never seen such a thing. It's not true. There's always been fighting in the White House. The question is how to manage it. And in the book, in Fight House, I suggest certain strategies and certain approaches and a paradigm for thinking about it so that we know what are the levers that a president has to control infighting if he or she so desires. And that's the key question, because sometimes presidents want a little creative tension in order to get things flowing and to get the best ideas to come out. Other presidents want to kind of put a brake on infighting, but whatever your approach, knowing the paradigm from the past and knowing what the levers are that you control will help you get the kind of White House you want.
So you just, I think you made a really interesting point. And I don't want to gloss right over it. There's so much to cover, but I don't want to cross over this too fast. You mentioned there's always been this sort of tension among senior staff and advisors and the cabinet, the people that surround a president. We know that staff rivalries go back to the founding. Hamilton and Burr and Jefferson were at odds. We've talked about in the past, and you cite Doris Kearns Goodwin and her analysis of President Lincoln's team of rivals. So what is it that drew you to this modern era, this contemporary era of Truman to Trump? How did you narrow that focus?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, as a historian, you need to narrow your focus. You can't just write a survey of everything or you're writing an encyclopedia. So I needed to come up with a focus and something that no one had done before. And obviously, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote that book, Team of Rivals, that looked at the Lincoln administration specifically. There's a hit musical you may have heard of called Hamilton that talks about rivalries in the Washington administration. But I looked around and I saw that nobody had done this analysis of infighting in the White House during the era of the White House staff era, which is really the modern presidency. There was a commission in the late 1930s called the Brownlow Commission. This Brownlow Commission during the Roosevelt administration looked at what the president had to deal with. We had a growing government and more American involvement in the world. And it had a famous four-word conclusion: the president needs help. And the help that it recommended was a series of administrative aides with, quote, a passion for anonymity. people who could kind of be behind the scenes and help the president get done what the president needs to get done. Now, we all know that the passion for anonymity has gone out the window, right? White House aides are often household names these days. But the idea that a president would have staff and personal staff that worked in the White House and reported to him was a relatively new phenomenon. And it happened under Roosevelt, but Truman was the first president to enter with a White House staff. So he had to think from the very beginning how he wanted to configure that staff so that it corresponded to what he was trying to accomplish. So it's really about the period in which presidents had a White House staff, knew they had a White House staff, and how to figure out how to deal with it.
So just help us understand. It might not be on everyone's fingertips. The White House complex. When we say someone works at the White House, how many people are we talking about? It's more than just the West Wing, but there's kind of layers and concentric circles of priority and power and such. What does the White House staff consist of? Who are we talking about?
So there's about 1,600 people who work in the EOP, the Executive Office of the President. The majority of those people are career officials who work year in, year out, administration in, administration out. If Biden were to beat Trump, many of those people will still stay. Those people include the top officials at the Office of Management and Budget, the National Security Council, the U.S. Trade Representative, the Drug Czar's office. Those people, for the most part, are career officials. Now, the top people at all of those agencies come and go with the president, and sometimes more than once with one president. But those are political appointees at the very top. But those agencies that staff the White House are largely career officials. Now, in that group of 1,600, there are also the people who we think of as White House aides, the people who might have appeared on the show The West Wing. Those are people who serve at the pleasure of the president. They're completely political appointees, and they staff the offices of, let's say, the Domestic Policy Council, the National Economic Council, the Office of Political Affairs, the Office of Public Liaison, the Chief of Staff's office. Those kinds of people come and go with the president. That, I determined, is about probably 400 people who are those political people who come and go with the president. And of them, there's probably about a dozen assistants to the president. Those are the highest level staffers. Think the chief of staff, the deputy chief of staff, the head of the Domestic Policy Council, head of the National Economic Council. So there's about a dozen of them. And then there's about 24 deputy assistants to the president, the top deputies to those people. So it's really about 30 people who are the top people. And for the most part, when I'm talking about a White House staffer in Fight House, it's really somebody in that universe of assistants to the president, deputy assistants to the president. Those are the top people.
I don't want to get ahead of myself because I do want to talk about this template for a moment. But you also cover the rest of the executive branch in the sense that there's the vice president, there's the secretaries, the heads of the different cabinet officials, cabinet agencies. They come into play with these rivalries more and less in different administrations. And they're really sometimes butting heads with those 30 top aides to the President of the United States. And that, there's some interesting analysis, I think, about how proximity matters. And we can get into that in just a little bit. But before we do, walk us through the template that you developed. How did you analyze White Houses that are so very different from, the Kennedy administration does not look like the Clinton administration, although the common myth or narrative might be that Clinton was trying to extend Camelot. So how did they, all these different ways of organizing, how did you understand staff function and dysfunction and management and rivalries?
So I did a lot of work on the Romney transition in 2012, where obviously Romney didn't win the election, but there was a transition team in place that was getting ready in case he had been victorious. And we put a lot of thought into the White House staff and how to manage it and what kind of structure you want. And as part of that, and another person who was on that team, by the way, was Ben Sasse, now Senator Sasse. So we had a lot of conversations about what works, what doesn't, and what are the levers that a president has to control things. And so if you wanted to have a staff that worked, one thing that we really thought was important was to have clear lines of assignment. Having senior advisors who kind of float around and do a whole bunch of things is often damaging. You want to have people who what their roles are, what their responsibilities are, who they report to, and who reports to them. So I think that was one thing. But in terms of the paradigm I came up with, in terms of the 3 levers of control that a president has, the 3 were, number 1 was ideological alignment. If you have people who are at odds ideologically, you're going to see more fighting among them. And so the famous fight between James Baker, the chief of staff, and Ed Meese, the senior advisor and counselor in the Reagan administration, that was one where Meese was seen as more conservative, Baker was seen as more pragmatic or moderate, and they often butted heads because of their different ideological perspectives. So more ideological alignment leads to less fighting, less ideological alignment can lead to more fighting. The second is process. Process is boring but incredibly important. Process is the way in
It sounds
which,
like you're talking about regulatory law.
yeah, but process is the way in which, or the way in which decisions get made in the White House. You tee up decisions to the president, and every decision has to go through a process. Does it get decided at the deputies committee? Does it get decided at the principals committee? Does it get decided at policy time with the president? What speed should this process take? Who gets invited to the meetings? Who doesn't get invited to the meetings? These are incredibly complex questions. There is a way to do it. It's passed on from administration to administration. That you're not going to see major process changes from a Democrat to a Republican administration or vice versa. You will see differences in adherence to the process. So every White House has these kinds of set ways of making policy, but some might circumvent the process, some get bogged down in the process. In the Bush 41 administration, so George H.W. Bush's administration, they were so shackled to process that things didn't get done, and some of the aides made jokey buttons that they put on their lapels that said "Born to Process," making a kind of joke about their inability to get stuff done, but they were really good at the process. One guy, it's a friend of mine, Hans Kuttner, was a very smart Princeton and Chicago guy who worked in that White House, but his boss really had him working on what the memos looked like to such a degree that his nickname became the Fontmeister. He was worried about the font of the White House memos instead of them focusing on the content. So process can bog you down.
If your White House staff, one tier beyond those top 30 advisors, if they're focused on margins and font, you've lost the thread. And it might not surprise that President Bush did not win his reelection.
Right, and so the Fontmeister was, it doesn't sound like that rough a nickname, but it was kind of a rough nickname in what it conveyed. And then the third thing, and this is really important, Kent, is presidential tolerance. And look, you as a leader of an organization have to recognize the amount that you will tolerate infighting in your staff to some degree determines how much infighting there will be. If you tell your people, I don't want to see this stuff, you guys have to work this out, this can't happen, it's unacceptable, you're going to have less infighting. Whereas if you step back and say, fight it out, let's see what happens, I'm curious, then you're going to see more infighting, and that's what happens.
Right. Now, and I apologize, I think I have some sirens going by. There's nothing I can do about that. But I want to back up to process just for a moment. And it was illustrative for me. I had not thought about the question, but contrasting each of the President Bushes, H.W. and George W., on one hand, we had a president who had a very low dysfunction domestic policy team and a relatively contentious foreign policy and national security team. And it seemed that it switched. And it struck me as odd, but once I got through the book, it made much more sense that the foreign policy team, the domestic policy team, the tax, the agencies that execute the law here domestically, they wouldn't necessarily follow the same adherence to willingness to tolerate dissent. They would not necessarily have the same ideological compatibility because the pool of talent that you're drawing from is quite different. Does that crop up through the whole era that you looked at, the staff era, where domestic and foreign policy can go different directions?
Yeah, yes, but it's most pronounced in the two Bushes, obviously, because they're father and son. The first Bush, Bush 41, has this kind of a paralyzed domestic policy process that was led by Dick Darman and John Sununu, who didn't want to hear new ideas, who berated and belittled people who came up with new ideas. And as a result, you had this kind of sclerotic domestic policy process, and you are correct to say that is in part why he didn't win. It didn't seem to the American people that he cared about their plight in terms of getting things done on the domestic policy front. At the same time, he had a relatively nimble foreign policy team that was very good at managing the end of the Cold War and the first Gulf War. And so that was a team of people who had worked together before, knew each other well, and they were in sync. The Bush 43 administration is really this stark contrast and real switch in that you have a domestic policy team that works pretty well. And it was hard for me to write that because I worked in that administration on the domestic policy side. I didn't want people to say, oh, you're just a homer, you're writing nice things about the administration you worked in. What I tried to do in Fight House is bring out quotes from others, from outsiders, who said, wow, this Bush team, they really are in sync and they don't leak. That was one thing, you know, in the Trump era, you hear reporters complaining, oh my gosh, these Trump people, they leak all the time. In the Bush 43 era, they complained, oh, these Bush staffers, they never leak. It's terrible. We can't get a leak out of them. So I have a bunch of quotes from reporters kind of complaining about the lack of leaks. But the foreign policy team in that administration was a bit of a mess, where you had really, really big dogs like Cheney and Rumsfeld and Rice and Powell, and they were at each other's throats, and it was really something that the administration had trouble controlling.
Well, and it led to some pretty significant consequences, not just at the global affairs level, but at the you talk about the special Armitage and the Scooter Libby disaster. Right. Just a genuine kind of moral disaster there. Again, good history to understand how these tensions have real world effects.
Yeah, we just have to back up for those who may not follow, because it was a while ago. And the moral disaster that you talk about is that Dick Armitage and Colin Powell were opposed to what the vice president of the Defense Department wanted. And Scooter Libby was chief of staff to Vice President Cheney. And the name of the CIA operative, Valerie Plame, was leaked. They launched an investigation into who leaked it. It turns out that Armitage at State had leaked it, but he did not own up publicly to having done so because he didn't want to harm him and Powell in their interpersonal war against defense and the vice president. And that's actually a quote that I have in the book. And so they pursue this investigation of who leaked it when the State Department people knew who leaked it and the Justice Department knew who leaked it, but they continued to pursue this investigation, and they caught Scooter Libby, who is a friend of mine, up in what's known as a perjury trap. He appeared to say something different than what somebody else said. He didn't even contradict himself, he contradicted someone else. That person, Judy Miller, was a New York Times reporter who later recanted her testimony, but nevertheless, Scooter was convicted unfairly, in my opinion. And I say it's the worst thing that anyone did to one another, a fellow colleague, in all of the years of White House rivalries that I talk about. And this is a period, and you see it, and I saw in the book, Kent, this is a period in which people do really nasty things, backbiting and undercutting, getting people fired and leaking about one another. But this person, Scooter Libby, was actually convicted of a crime because his interagency rival didn't want to own up to what had happened.
Right. Let's talk a bit about principles. I alluded to this at the beginning with the cabinet secretaries and the vice president.
So it is a moral disaster. I got on my high horse a bit.
That's all right. High horse for a historian. That's what we ask for when we read histories, is to get a view and get their understanding of how things played out. I want to talk a little bit about RFK and LBJ. Bobby Kennedy looms large in our historic memory, and Johnson probably even bigger. And these men did not like each other.
No, sir.
They had very different relationships with the president. Can you walk us through that a little bit? What is different about rivalries among principals versus rivalries at the staff level? And is there any lessons for us about the Kennedy administration from that?
Yeah, it's interesting, Kent. In this book, in Fight House, I try and have this kind of Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead ethic, meaning this whole notion that this is happening while Hamlet is doing his big things. You've got the aides on the side doing these other things. And for the most part, the fights are not really with the president. The president's not the one butting heads. It's the lower level staff members. In the Kennedy administration, you actually had the principals more involved, namely the attorney general, the vice president Johnson, and then after John F. Kennedy is tragically assassinated, you have the switch there. And as I like these interesting switches in history. And then once Johnson now becomes the president, Kennedy's still the attorney general, but Johnson kind of beneath RFK when JFK was president, and now Johnson is president and he's above RFK, and neither man liked the other, and it led to real problems, including, I tell this great story in the book that when the first cabinet meeting of the new Johnson administration happens, Bobby Kennedy comes in late. And Johnson was convinced that Kennedy came in late to show him up. And they have a fight in the Oval Office after this meeting. And after that, they didn't speak for 2 months. Now, look, there's sometimes you don't talk to somebody for 2 months, and that's fine. But this was the sitting attorney general and the president of the United States did not speak to each other for 2 months. And that is a tiff of consequence. It's a little odd for those people not to talk for such a long period.
I want to remind people, I could do this all day. I enjoyed the book. I always enjoy my conversations with Tevi about books and history. But if you want to participate, I need you to send in questions. So the buttons at the bottom of your screen there, or events@cei.org, and we'll get as many of those questions into Tevi as I can. Another theme that I saw throughout, and you address it, but I'd like you to unpack it for us a little bit, is the role that is played by people who operate at this level for long periods of time. And you talked about your experience with the transition teams often look, well, who are the staff people, who are the principals last time around when we were in charge? And that's how you start to generate lists of how an administration might be staffed or who to call to get suggestions. The Nixon era White House team might have the record for the most influence through time. These principles showed up over and over again for Ford, for President Reagan, for President Bush. Can you talk a little bit about the role that these rivalries play through time? Do we tend to see, for example, once there's a rivalry, those people are always at odds, or do they shift and ally maybe in future administrations when their roles are changed?
Yeah, I think what you see more often, you don't see people who are rivals forgiving each other later. What you see sometimes the people who are allies becoming rivals later. I think that's a more frequent occurrence. So Cheney and Powell were allies in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War under Bush 41, but under Bush 43, they were much more rivals and at each other's throats. I think that's an interesting point that you raised. And of course, Cheney does start in the Nixon administration, and he and Rumsfeld are there. They both become chief of staff and deputy chief of staff under Ford. But you're right, there are a bunch of people who are recurring characters in the book that started in that Nixon administration, including Al Haig, who fought with everybody in Nixon and Ford and then becomes Secretary of State under Reagan and continues to fight with people. In fact, one of my favorite stories in the book is Al Haig is quite imperious as the chief of staff, he's imperious as chief of staff, but I'm talking about it now when he's Secretary of State under Reagan. And the people in the White House, including Chief of Staff Jim Baker and Deputy Chief of Staff Mike Deaver, don't like him very much. And they actually keep him off motorcades and Air Force One and Marine One, and they try and keep him away from the president to some degree. And Haig knows what's going on, doesn't like it, and he complains about the guerrillas in the White House who are out to get him. And Mike Deaver, 42-year-old Deputy Chief of Staff, actually dresses up in a guerrilla costume and parades around the White House making fun of Haig, which I just found astounding. In this era of Twitter and iPhone cameras, you'd never see somebody do that. I have not found a picture of Deaver in a gorilla suit making fun of Haig, but it is just amazing that he did it.
Well, that story also draws out, I hadn't thought about it before, but there's an important player who's rarely named in the book, but is always kind of in the public mind during a given administration. Nancy Reagan had an important role to play in that story. The challenges that Bobby Kennedy brought to then newly president Lyndon Johnson was in part a grievance about how his sister-in-law had been treated. What role do first ladies and their staff, how does that play into all this?
Yeah, it's true. With Bobby Kennedy, they said that Bobby Kennedy hated Lyndon Johnson, but his wife hated Lyndon Johnson even more.
Right.
And that on the rare occasions that Lyndon Johnson would come to Hickory Hill, which was the RFK estate, she would make sure that he got the worst tables at their parties. So there's some petty stuff there. But you're right. For the most part, I don't spend a lot of time on the first ladies in the book, except with the exception of Nancy Reagan, who had a very bad relationship with Don Regan, who was the second chief of staff under Reagan. And they fought, and at one point, Reagan actually hung up on Nancy Reagan. And when Jim Baker, who was the first chief of staff and knew how the White House worked, heard this, he said, "That's not a firing offense, that's a hanging offense," because he knew how egregious it was to hang up on Nancy Reagan. And indeed, Reagan did not last much longer, and he was fired not long after that incident.
I think that this topic also, it bleeds into more recent history. There's family, the spouse of the president, and then there's family. And you have an interesting discussion of the role in the White House staff played by Valerie Jarrett for President Obama. And they developed a nickname for her, the Night Stalker, because not only by day would she be involved in the process, the transparent process within the White House, but then she would visit in the residence with the Obamas, and she had these deep ties to them, longstanding ties to them. Can you unpack that for us? And how do we understand that today with the president's daughter being part of the White House team?
Yeah, it's a good point. So Valerie Jarrett, very close to Michelle and Barack Obama, knew them before they got married, was with them as they were dating, and eventually did get married. And so she has a long-standing tie there. And she comes to the White House, and she's kind of part of the operation, but in some ways above it. And because she's close friends with them, she does get to go to the residence at night, which most White House staffers never do. I mean, I worked in the Bush White House for a number of years. I was in the residence, but I was never in the residence at night when the Bush family's hanging out. I mean, it's a relatively rare thing. And so she could get her way by talking about what policies she wanted to pursue afterwards. Now, she denied that she did that, but the White House staffers had a pretty good feeling that she was doing that. And that's what led to the nickname, the Night Stalker. And by the way, there are unbelievably great nicknames in the book, throughout the book, and I even compile them in an appendix. So if those listeners out there want to purchase the book Fight House, you will get a great appendix of White House nicknames that have been used throughout the years. Now, Valerie Jarrett, because she had this relatively elevated position, she alienated the chiefs of staff. So first, Rahm Emanuel was the chief of staff in the first year of the administration until, as Matt Continetti put it, he suddenly decided an overwhelming desire to go run for mayor of Chicago. And so he leaves after a year. And then you have another former mayor of Chicago, Bill Daley, comes, and he dislikes Jarrett so much that he can't even stand to be in the same room with her. So Obama goes through, I think, 4 chiefs of staff in his first term. In the second term, the new chief of staff, Tom Donilon, kind of recognizes her role and that he, in some ways, is subordinate to her. And by not running afoul of her, he manages to last pretty much the whole administration, the whole second term, and does pretty well there. So I think recognizing some situations, I mean, you said something about family members. When you have a White House, the only people you can't fire are the vice president and family members, usually the first lady in some White Houses, including this recent one, but also in the Kennedy administration, you had more family members. But somebody who is either family or like family is protected and can't be fired. And when you're the chief of staff or any White House staffer, you kind of have to figure out how to operate around that situation.
I've got a question here from Eamon Simon. Are there any areas today where cabinet government is feasible, where you can really delegate out that policymaking process?
Yeah, no, Eamon is a very smart and wise guy in the ways of government. So thank you for that question. Look, throughout my book, I talk about presidents who come in and say they believe in cabinet government. Nixon especially believed in cabinet government, he said. But when it came down to running foreign policy, he wanted Kissinger, who's the national security advisor, who was next to him in the White House. He wanted Kissinger to be there discussing grand strategic alliances with him. And he thought less of William Rogers, who was a longstanding friend of Nixon and was a former attorney general in the Eisenhower administration. He was Secretary of State under Nixon, but he was kind of shunted aside, even though Nixon professed to be in favor of cabinet government. So I think cabinet government is a great idea. In some ways, it can help you get more stuff done. But on the other hand, presidents know that they're on the hook for what cabinet officers do. And if cabinet officers are doing things that are showing up in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal front pages that make them look bad, and they don't know about it, that's a real problem. So that's why I think White House has looked to try and exercise more and more control rather than less and less control that would enable cabinet government to take place.
And is that, it seems like there's another side of the coin to that, which is the contemporary understanding of the presidency, this sort of imperial, personality-driven presidency, is the public, the electorate. We would never hold an attorney general culpable for wrongdoing. We would hold the president culpable for wrongdoing of the attorney general. Is it not just the concentration of control at the White House, but also the expectations? I mean, do we bear some responsibility for this, for the way we have built up the presidency over time to be this grand kind of imperial place?
Yeah, well, that's true. And in fact, in my last book, Shall We Wake the President, I talk about presidents and disasters and how over time presidents have gotten more and more involved in disasters to the point where we have unrealistic expectations. You know, Katrina happens. Is Bush supposed to push the floodwaters back? You've got the virus now. You know, it's not realistic to expect the president to come up with the vaccine himself. I mean, so much of this has to happen at lower levels of government, but the presidents are responsible and seen as responsible from their higher level of government, even though they don't really control what's going on in those senses. So yeah, we do have more and more expectations on government. There's a guy named Jeremy Surrey, who's a presidential expert at the University of Texas, wrote a book called The Impossible Presidency. The idea is that we've put too much on the presidency. And I think the presidency could actually be more effective, and I think this would be in line with CEI's mission and interest. If you kind of cabined what they did, you had them focus on the constitutional responsibilities rather than this ever more expanding role. Now, part of the problem with that is that Congress has ceded so much of its responsibilities. In Congress, they legislate these vague pieces of legislation. They put out these bills, and then they tell the administrative agencies, which are under the president, go write the thousands and tens of thousands of pages of regulations, which I know you guys work so well in combating sometimes when they're ridiculous or overblown or not in line with the original legislation. But the fact of the matter is, the agencies have to do that because Congress, and that doesn't mean they have to overreach, but they have to write the explaining administrative rules because Congress doesn't give the detail. And so you just put something out there and people don't know how to administer it, and it's the agencies that have to tell you that. So I think I would like to see more of the balance shift towards Congress, and Congress actually pass the legislation that governs what happens rather than expect the president to do everything.
Is it fair, or do we go too far if we say, well, this all just boils down to personalities? You know, regardless of how they campaign or what a president says he or she wants to do as far as a mode of governing, that this really just comes back to who they are. There's this great line I want to read. You wrote about Nixon. You say, the Nixon staff had some of the bitterest rivalries in the White House staff era, and the dysfunctionalities behind those rivalries usually reflected the personality of the suspicious Nixon. And in parallel, I think there's all of these quotes, not just from former aides, but from across the kind of analytical spectrum about President George W. Bush, that he's the most disciplined man that someone has ever met, that he's disciplined in his faith, he's disciplined in his approach to management, he's disciplined in his exercise. It really is a White House staff really just a reflection of personality? Is that how we need to judge who to elect?
There's no doubt that there is a huge amount of reflection of the principle in the White House staff, what it looks like, how it's structured, how it's run. So yes, George W. Bush was all about the discipline, and you did have the Nixon administration. Nixon was kind of suspicious and paranoid, and that took place among the staff. But it's not everything. I mean, there are structures in place. There are processes that go from administration to administration. So I think a historian can look back and say, oh, now I see how the tendencies of Jimmy Carter as a micromanager led to him micromanaging the staff. But it's not always apparent at the time, and it's not necessarily something that can govern how you operate in that environment. You've got to operate the best way you can without saying, well, the president is suspicious, so I should act suspiciously to my compadres. I think it's more than the more than just the personality of the principal, but I think the personality of the principal is a useful lens with which we can look back and see how things played out.
I've got a really interesting question here from Maggie Chambers. There's a good insight here. Do you think the Trump administration will realign the way he processes policy in the White House if he's reelected, considering the way he was critiqued in the media during the first term? And I think the insight here is that oftentimes first terms and second terms don't look the same. So do you have any expectations about the Trump administration if there's a second term?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Maggie. Thank you for that. Look, the Trump administration in some ways has had 3, maybe 4 terms. I mean, you had Reince Priebus, who was trying to manage a traditional Republican administration when that is not what we had. And there were kind of 3 areas or 3 groupings in that first White House. There was the kind of traditional Republicans that were headed by Priebus. There were the Bannonites, who were kind of more blow everything up. And then you had the globalists, or the Democrats, or the New Yorkers, as people called Cohen, Kushner, and Ivanka. So that was the first grouping. And then you had John Kelly, who's not a real policy person, but a former general who really cared about the process. He tried to make things more buttoned down, try to control the president. And that did calm down some of the fighting, it appeared, from the outside. We're not going to know everything until the archives open up and we see the oral histories and all that. But from what I saw, some of the fighting calmed down under Kelly. And then you had Mulvaney took over as the third guy, and he was more ideological, probably more aligned with CEI and its perspective, but trying to get conservative stuff done while not actively not trying to manage the president, because he saw that that might not work. Now, obviously, we have Meadows, and it's too soon to tell what the Meadows approach is. Maybe inside you can tell, but from the outside, I don't have enough information. So I think these things shift depending in part on the chief of staff, on how the president wants to approach it. And we've long had this situation of second terms being very different and often worse than first terms. I mean, look at the Reagan first term was pretty successful with Jim Baker as chief of staff. Second term with Don Reagan as chief of staff and bogged down by Iran-Contra, not as successful. So you definitely have these shifts depending in part on time. First term is different from second term, and in part on personalities, meaning who are the people running the White House. So I can't yet tell you what's going to happen in a second term. I can just promise you, based on what we've seen in the Trump administration, that it'll be different from some of the things we're seeing in the first term.
Yeah. And where does, just to extend that last conversation, just one moment, there's something of I think an intellectual crutch or a gossipy crutch when we're in Washington talking about the White House, and that is the comment, well, now they're just looking at the legacy, right? Is it the case that we see first term really focused on either legislative or foreign policy achievements, and the second term tends to be these gauzier, longer term, maybe more difficult to achieve milestone type achievements, the moonshots, if you will?
Yeah, I would say the first term is more focused on building the case for reelection, and that includes legislative and policy accomplishments. I think the second term starts out that way as well in terms of building on the record of accomplishment. But towards the 3/4 mark, meaning after year 6 or so, then they start talking about legacy. What's our legacy going to be? You often have a staffer writing some internal history of the administration. You start doing record of accomplishments lists, both at the agency level and at the White House. So I think that legacy thing does come late in the second term. Now, I don't know if that will be the case in this president. He's obviously been non-traditional, so maybe they're not going to have that same approach. But it is certainly something that you see late in the second term, this kind of quest for legacy.
Can you talk a little bit as a measure of dysfunction or rivalry, as a tactic to achieve some sort of policy advantage or stratagem? All through the book, we have discussion of leaking, efforts to shut down leaking, tolerance of leaking. Just unpack that. I think it's really interesting kind of vein that flows through the whole book, and I'd love to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Look, leaking is one of your primary weapons to use against your colleagues. Somebody's doing something you don't like and you can't get it changed. Sometimes you go to the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or whatever, and put that out there. and maybe you get your colleague rebuked. Maybe it makes you look good. Jim Baker was a famous leaker. What he would do is he would put out his narrative of the Reagan administration. He didn't leak by name, he leaked anonymously. And those pieces that gave his narrative of the Reagan administration would sort of coincidentally also praise Baker and his great management and how effective he is. So by kind of buttering up the reporters, he got himself buttered up in the press. And I think that is a time-worn strategy that is often effective. That doesn't mean I'm in favor of leaking. I'm just saying this is how some people use it. Now, it can get nastier when you start to have people leaking negative things about their colleagues and especially their rivals. And sometimes they will even do the misdirected leak or the carom shot, where they will leak about someone else in the diction of a third person. And this was a famous thing with Dick Darman, who was very bright, but also loved to tell you how smart he was. And he used to like to use big words. So people who wanted to leak about Darman would use a word like inchoate. And they'd say, oh, big word quote, that must have come from Darman. Similarly, Don Regan had a verbal tick where he would end sentences with and the like. And so when they would leak, when Reagan aides who didn't like Reagan would leak something and they wanted people to think that Reagan had leaked it, they would use the phrase and the like at the end of their phrases, and people might think that Reagan was there. Sununu and Darman in the George H.W. Bush administration were infamous for looking carefully at the Washington Post in the morning, reading the quotes and trying to figure out who the quotes came from, and then going to the offices of the people and berating them because of the perceived leak. So it does have consequences if you're seen as a leaker, even if you're not necessarily the one doing the leaking.
And it seems, I want to make a fine point here, a narrow point, but there's very concrete examples about, while oftentimes this would have to do with kind of personality driven or personal rivalry. I don't like this other person in the administration, I'm going to make them look bad and make myself look good. There were very real world consequences when it came to direction of the administration, or maybe closing off an avenue or trial balloons and getting policy enacted, or at least policy through the White House process. And I think that's illustrated very well here with some of the examples you have. So I enjoyed that. That was part of the treat for me to read this. Leaking also involves, and it bleeds into something that you referenced here earlier, the names and the nicknames. And what, aside from the cleverness of them, or the schoolyard taunt aspect of them, what purpose do they play? We're talking about professionals at the top of their game. They're working in one of the most important policymaking teams in the world at that time, and they're calling each other schoolyard names. Does it have real world effect? What does it mean that people walk around calling David Gergen names?
Look, the people here, you don't get a lot about them in the press. I mean, you get some stuff, but you get one first impression. And if that first impression comes from a nickname, that is how you view the person forevermore. So Larry Speaks did not like David Gergen, and he tried to diminish him by making fun of his height. He was a very tall guy. So he used to call him the tall guy, or tall. It became abbreviated to that. And he would also play tricks on him. So when Gergen went to the podium to do a briefing, they would lower the podium and tighten the screws so that Gergen would look absurdly tall looming over this podium, and it would just kind of foster this image of him kind of a tall, gangly, awkward guy. I thought a better nickname for Gergen was actually Professor Leaky, because he was known to have such close relations to the press, and he was always leaking to the press, and he had this professorial air about him. And there's a great story in the book that in the time after Reagan is shot, in the assassination in early '81, Gergen is in the Situation Room as they're trying to hash things out, and there's the famous scene in which Haig runs out of the Situation Room, runs up the stairs and says, "I'm in charge here," even though he'd been told not to say that, and he was forever ridiculed by that. But Gergen keeps excusing himself and leaving the room, and Dick Allen, who's the National Security Advisor, thought that Gergen wasn't necessarily using the restroom, but that he was calling reporter friends. And so either way, Professor Leakey would have applied to whatever he was doing, but he was leaving the room a lot. And so that kind of gives us a sense of Gergen as a staffer.
Okay. I want to hear a little bit more about Trump, right? This is the president in the whole sweep of the book that justifiably, I think you have the slimmest treatment of, because the evidence, the archives, the histories, all of those things are not out. But you do have some insights about the way his operation works and whether or not it works for him. On this scorecard that you've created with these 3 variables, tell us about the current White House, at least as far as we can know.
Right. So again, in the appendix of the book, I do have this scorecard, and I list each administration according to the 3 levers: ideological discord, process, and presidential tolerance. So on those 3 levers, the ideological discord is something that was certainly high in the first year of the Trump administration. I just defined the 3 teams earlier, the kind of so-called globalists or Democrats, plus the Bannonites, plus the kind of traditional Republicans. Those are 3 teams. Usually you have 2 teams fighting in the White House, and this was kind of triangulation of a different sort of 3 teams fighting each other. So there did seem to be ideological disalignment. But one thing I noticed on the Trump administration that is really interesting, Ken, is that on issues in which there is agreement, not only within the Trump administration, but within the Republican Party and the conservative movement in general, you're seeing less fighting. So for example, the issues that unite Republicans today, as I see it, are judges, right? Getting conservative constitutional originalist type judges, lower taxes, support for Israel, and criticism of the mainstream media and liberal elites. And you're not going to see a lot of disagreement among Republicans on those issues, and you're not hearing a lot of stories about fighting within the White House on those issues. I guess law and order and pushback against riots gone amok would be another issue. And also, you're not seeing infighting on those issues. But there are issues where there is disagreement, again, within the Republican base, but also within the White House. That's on issues like immigration and trade. And you hear a lot about infighting on those issues. So I think that the ideological paradigm I came up with really is reflective not only of what's going on in the administration, but within the larger conservative movement. The second thing is process. We have seen a lot of indications that it's a more freewheeling process in this administration than in the immediate predecessors, let's say the Obama or the Bush 43 White Houses, which were pretty buttoned down in terms of process for the most part. And so when you don't have a process, when you don't have a way in which you and your rival can go in front of the president, make your case, and then know the case has been fairly heard, and then you lock arms afterwards after the decision is made. If you don't have that, then you're more apt to go to the press and leak. So process is something that I think is valuable in controlling infighting, but the process, as I said, has been more freewheeling in this administration. And then the third is presidential tolerance. And I have a great story in the book of, at one point, there is a fight between A.J. Delgado and Hope Hicks. And this is on the Trump campaign on the Trump plane, Trump Force One, before the election of 2016. And these 2 women are flanking Trump and yelling. And Trump is reading a newspaper as they're screaming. And he puts down the newspaper and says, "Cat fight." And that is not a president who is intolerant of fighting, but kind of says, "I enjoy this. I don't mind watching it. Everybody come look in." So that's in stark contrast to Obama, for example, who there's one story I tell about Alyssa Mastromonaco, who was the deputy chief of staff. She felt slighted in an article in the New York Times about her. She felt that her colleagues had leaked against her. She sends a blistering email to the whole staff complaining about how she was treated. And Obama calls her to the Oval Office. She doesn't know why. She's the deputy chief of staff. It could be a million reasons. He calls her in, and he looks at her and says, "That was quite the email you sent," suggesting that he's aware of what's going on. He knows when people are infighting, and he does not have a high level of tolerance for it. And as you and I talked about in the virtual green room, that doesn't necessarily mean that he got better results, right? There was not a ton of infighting in the Obama administration by historical standards, although I do say that there was more than we knew about at the time because they were good at controlling it in the media. But what are his legislative accomplishments of his second term? I'm hard pressed to find them. So you could have less infighting, but not necessarily better results. But on those 3 levers, the Trump administration unsurprisingly ranks high, and therefore you're going to see more discord, more infighting.
Are there presidents who, through the course of doing the research, and there's a very impressive list of folks that you consulted in the acknowledgments. I'm one of those people that goes to the acknowledgments and reads, like, who did Tevi talk to? Are there presidents who come off better than you expected? I mean, you've been thinking about these issues and studying White Houses for, I don't know, 20, 30 years now. What surprised you?
You know what continually surprises me is Bill Clinton. Not a fan. I worked in Congress opposing his agenda in the 90s. And, you know, I certainly have issues with his personal behavior. But it seems like he knew how to control White House infighting to get what he wanted from his staff. So in the first 2 years after his election, the staff definitely moved to the left and his administration tacked left. And he was rebuked at the polls in the 1994 elections that Republicans take over the House and Senate for the first time in 40 years. But he recognizes he has to readjust, and he brings in this kind of secret aide, codenamed Charlie. Charlie turns out to be Dick Morris. And Dick Morris is of more conservative nature, even though at the time he was still a Democrat, but he was more conservative than the regular White House aides. Now, once he is outed as Morris, this Charlie guy, he fights hammer and tongs with people like George Stephanopoulos and Harold Ickes, who are definitely of a more liberal bent. And Stephanopoulos' memoir, All Too Human, which is, by the way, an excellent memoir, one of the best White House memoirs, is throughout a litany of complaints about Dick Morris, how much he disliked him, the nicknames he gave him, the jokes he told about him. But at the end, he concludes that Clinton got better results out of his staff by bringing in Morris, who brought a different ideological perspective. And so I got the sense that Clinton kind of knew what he was doing there. Also, in the second term, there was surprisingly little infighting that I found out about in that White House. And you wonder why, because it was a time of great upheaval with the impeachment. And that was actually the reason. They sort of circled the wagons together in opposition to the Republican onslaught. And the very real threat at the time that Clinton might be impeached and kicked out of office. That was what some people thought at the time. And so there's a great quote in there from Ann Lewis, who's Barney Frank's sister. And she's asked about Clinton and his shenanigans with women and his inappropriate behavior and the fact that he had a really inappropriate relationship with an intern in the Oval Office and lied about it. And she looks at the interviewer and says, "What do you want me to do? Side with Henry Hyde and Newt Gingrich?" I mean, she says that what she was saying is that to her, the Republicans were a greater enemy. And it was more important to her to circle the wagons and stick with her colleagues in the White House and present a united front than to give the Gingriches and the Hydes an opportunity to depose Clinton and kick him out of office.
Just a quick point to follow up on that, and then we have time for one last question, and I want to, for that question, I want to read something from your Chapter 7 on President Reagan. But to follow up on what you said, for anyone interested in that era, and in particular, I would recommend the Stephanopoulos memoir. It is candid. He's a very good writer, and there's a painfully poignant episode that he illustrates where he found himself sitting in a hotel room in Indianapolis doing research, trying to take down another candidate, and he had to reevaluate his entire political career with the lens of, am I in this to create good things and to do good through an administration, or am I in this just to tear down people and create discord? And it's a very good memoir. At the time, it came out and it created a little bit of a stir because he released it and it was a bit of a tell-all while the president was still in office. Today we see memoirs and tell-alls and whatnot coming out every third week, it seems like, with the current administration. So it was a different era, different time. And that is my segue, if I needed one, to this last question. Tevi, I want to ask you about a line that you have from a really tremendous communicator, Reagan speechwriter, Peter Robinson. He writes, there was a lot more infighting going on in the Reagan White House than anybody was aware of, because there was no such thing as tweeter, Twitter, twatter in those days. and then you go on to talk a little bit more about how we learn about internal fights today in the media environment. And could you just, the last couple of minutes that we have here, expound upon how the media has changed and what that means for managing the White House, knowing that there's a much thinner veil between what happens behind the doors in 1600 Pennsylvania and the press?
Yeah, so that quote, that Twitter twatter quote by Peter Robinson was really instrumental in shaping how I approached this book, because I came across it right at the beginning of when I was starting the process of writing the book. And it kind of encapsulated this notion in my mind that every White House has fights. The question is, how do they deal with them, and which ones have more, which ones have less? But there's always going to be fighting. Then what? It's not enough to say, oh, there's fighting in this White House. So I thought that was really instrumental in saying how the media also shapes the environment. The media is so important in terms of highlighting certain things about various administrations. And if they want to highlight infighting, like they do with the Trump administration, you hear a lot about it. In the Obama administration, as I said, there was probably objectively less fighting, but there was also less talk about the fighting because the media didn't really want to play up that narrative. And so I think it is, it's just indicative of the times in which we live. I just want to add that Joel Zinberg, who is on this call, sent in a question. I don't want to ignore his question because it plays into this, because he says that Trump, and Joel worked in the White House, as you know, he says that Trump seems to be experimenting with different styles as he goes through the administration to see what works and what doesn't. And I think the fact that Trump is new to politics has something to do with that. He doesn't have a set approach like a George H.W. Bush did, who'd been in politics for his whole career. And he moves back and forth. Some things work, some things don't. But I do think it is an interesting idea that Joel puts out there, that he's using this experimentation process. And I don't really know of other presidents who were experimenting that much. I mean, once you're there, you're usually a fully formed person with fully formed views and long-standing relationships inside Washington, and you know how you're going to approach things. And so I think Fight House is just a, by the way, I would urge people before they get off the call to go out and buy Fight House. It's available on Amazon and other platforms. And I think CEI is going to have a link to where you can purchase it. But I think Fight House just tells us something about the stakes in government these days are so high. There's so much going on. There's so much, so the government's spending so much money. They're getting involved in so many different aspects of our lives. So these things are high stakes and they really matter. And that's why people are fighting. If it were just about, what color to paint the walls, you wouldn't have fight.
Very good. I want to thank you. This is a book that I've recommended not only for people that are just interested in history and the way our government works, big players doing big things, but also practitioners, people that hope to work at the White House or in the White House, people like yourself who have planned transitions. There's plenty here that you can take away and actually apply. So very grateful for you to have done the book, but also to spend time with us and join us, Tevi. Thank you. For our audience, I want to make sure that you're all aware of a couple upcoming events that we have. Next Tuesday, the next in our series of Repeal for Resilience, we'll be talking with Securities and Exchange Commissioner Hester Peirce, as well as former Commissioner Paul Atkins. At the end of the month, on the 30th, we'll be presenting the annual Julian L. Simon Memorial Award to Professor Steve Horwitz. I know we have something special planned in the form of not only a longer form Q&A, but also video. So I hope you'll register and take part in that event on Wednesday the 30th. 2 more book events are on tap, already scheduled for October. We heard mention of my colleague, Joel Zinberg, who came to CEI from the President's Council of Economic Advisors. On October 14th, we'll feature a new book called You're Hired by former CEA staff economist Casey Mulligan. And just before that, on the 8th, I'll be joined by Professor Jonathan Adler, and we will talk to Ilya Shapiro at the Cato Institute about his new book coming out this week, Supreme Disorder. 2 favors I have to ask of all of you. Please take a moment. We have a very short survey. I think it's only 3 or 4 questions. It will automatically populate as you close out of this program. Let us know your feedback. Give us ideas about what we can do a little bit better and topics that you'd like to see explored. And then finally, go out and buy the book. Capitalism works when we support people doing good research. So right here, we have Fight House and Tevi Troy joining us. Please go out and take a look at it. That's all for today.